Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My parents refused to buy me even the smallest birthday present, not a card, not a single thoughtful gesture, while at the same time signing over an entire house to my younger sister. Can you guess what happened next? I finally stopped being the family wallet, and from that moment on I started writing a different story for myself, one where I was no longer the person footing every bill and quietly swallowing every insult just to keep the peace. That night, on my birthday, we all sat at a restaurant that I had chosen and paid for because that is what I always did. I had been conditioned for years to pick up the check without anyone even saying thank you. When the food was cleared away and the conversation drifted, my mom leaned over and casually mentioned that they had helped Grace close on her first place. I thought she meant maybe co-signing or spotting her part of a down payment. But then Grace chimed in, grinning, saying she finally had her own house with a yard, and the words landed like a slap I could not recover from in the moment. A whole house. Meanwhile, I had been told there was nothing extra for my birthday. I forced myself to smile, nodded politely, and handed my credit card to the waiter to cover everyone's meals, drinks, and desserts. Nobody even blinked. Driving home, the anger that had been simmering in me for years started boiling over. My boyfriend Evan sat quietly in the passenger seat, glancing at me, sensing the storm. He did not need to say much. He had witnessed countless times how my parents leaned on me financially. At Christmas, when I covered the entire dinner because things were tight. When their car broke down and I quietly transferred money to my dad's account. When my mom wanted a new phone but insisted she could not afford it, so I added her to my plan and paid the bill every single month. At first, I told myself it was just being a good daughter, helping out, doing my part. But hearing that my sister had been handed a whole house while my birthday had been dismissed with nothing, not even a cheap bouquet from the grocery store, ripped away whatever excuses I had left. Evan asked me one simple question that changed everything. What would actually happen if you just stopped paying? For years, I had never dared to even imagine it. I thought the family would collapse without me, that I would be branded selfish, ungrateful, cold. But as I stared at the road ahead, I realized the only person collapsing under this arrangement was me. When we got home, I did something I had never done before. I pulled every bank statement I could access from the last 5 years. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a notepad, and I started writing down every dollar I had spent on family obligations. Holiday dinners, car repairs, phone bills, airline tickets for visits, hospital copays, birthday gifts for other people. The list grew and grew until I filled pages. The total was not just high, it was staggering. I had been subsidizing their lives in ways I had never even acknowledged, quietly filling every gap, erasing every crisis before it could inconvenience them. The realization hit me like a wave. My parents did not see me as their daughter. They saw me as their safety net, their backup plan, their financial cushion. And my sister, who had never once pulled out her own wallet at dinner, who could not even pay her car insurance on time without someone bailing her out, had been handed the crown jewel, an actual house. It was late by then, past midnight, and Evan had already gone to bed, but I sat awake with my spreadsheets, adding categories, color-coding years, making sure nothing slipped through. At the top, I wrote one phrase in bold: "It all evens out." For the first time in my life, I felt like I had evidence. Not just feelings, not just resentment, but cold, undeniable numbers. I stared at my phone for a long time, debating what to do. Finally, I typed a short text to my mom. "I'm changing how I do money with the family. We need to talk." The 3 dots appeared almost instantly, and her reply came fast: "Don't make drama." I laughed out loud, alone at the table, because the irony was so sharp I could taste it. I was done being their wallet, and if that counted as drama, then fine, I would embrace it. Before I went to bed, I opened the family phone account, the one I had been paying for since my 20s. Everyone was still on it: Mom, Dad, Grace. They had never once contributed a cent toward it. With a few clicks, I transferred my own number out to a separate carrier and scheduled termination notices for the rest. They would get their warning soon enough, along with the first bill in their own name. As I shut the laptop, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years I had been the invisible net catching everyone else's falls, and in return I had been mocked, dismissed, and taken for granted. That night, I decided the net was gone. They would learn to stand on their own legs, or they would hit the ground. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility. And that, honestly, was just the beginning. The morning after Christmas always looks the same in our family chat with its predictable photos of leftovers and sleepy jokes about early flights and long drives. Yet this time the rhythm broke as the payment requests I had set in motion began landing on phones with the subtle weight of accountability, and within minutes the private messages started, some tentative and curious, others prickly and performative, each of them circling the same point as if changing the phrasing could change the reality that the bill no longer vanished into the soft fog of my credit limit. Mom tried first with a voice note that sounded like a lullaby played on a cracked speaker, asking me to consider the spirit of the season and reminding me of how I used to beam when I covered everyone, because generosity had always been my love language. To which I replied gently that love languages are not contracts and that, while I do not regret past choices, I am no longer willing to subsidize the parts of our family story that require me to be quiet to keep the peace, because peace, that is, purchased one swipe at a time, is not peace, it is avoidance with a bow on it. Aunt Linda came next with the breezy tone she uses when she feels cornered but refuses to admit it, posting in the group chat a joke about corporate memos and holiday compliance policies, which earned the usual nervous laughter emojis from cousins who would rather pass the popcorn than pick a side, and when I answered, I did not try to match her performance, because I have learned that spectacle is the shield people use when they do not want to discuss facts. So I said, in writing and without heat, that separate checks were requested at the table, that the totals were fair and included an appropriate tip, and that moving forward the only expectation is clarity before we sit down, not guilt after the plates are cleared. Evan strutted into the conversation with a speech about how giving should be effortless and how scoring each other like a spreadsheet ruins the vibe of family, which would have sounded noble if he had not been the first one at every table to recommend another round he did not plan to pay for, and I reminded him, as kindly as a sister can, that tracking costs does not ruin the vibe. It reveals the vibe we already built, because if you feel offended by the math, it means the story you told yourself about fairness never included your share. The cousins had planned a brunch for the following day, something simple at a spot with bottomless coffee and a wait list that usually bends for us, because the manager knows our last name, and the last name knows my card. And as the time approached, I called the restaurant to release any stored payment information tied to me, and to confirm the reservation now required each guest to pre-authorize a minimum with their own card, which the manager appreciated because nothing makes service people calmer than rules that distribute risk, and when I arrived I felt a small, private relief knowing the line had been drawn before the first glass of anything touched the table. Cousin Jenna, who is always moved with the quiet grace of someone who listens before speaking, pulled me aside at the door to say she had already covered her share from last night and that she understood why I was making changes. Not because she agreed with every detail, but because she has also felt the slow resentment that grows when one person keeps the machine running and nobody else lifts the hood, and her support, even in that soft, qualified way, steadied me more than I expected because it reminded me that I was not demanding anything unreasonable. I was asking adults to act like adults. We were seated, menus opened, water poured, and for a rare minute the conversation flowed as if the old pattern had never existed, until Aunt Linda swept in late with her familiar air of smiling urgency. The kind that pretends to apologize while assigning blame, announcing to the table and to the manager hovering nearby that we could put it on Maya's tab the way we always do, and the manager, who had received my call earlier, responded with the professional calm that only facts can give, explaining that the reservation required individual pre-authorizations and that no single card would be used to guarantee the table. Linda laughed a little too sharply and said the manager must be new, then turned to me, eyebrows lifted with that dare I know by heart, as if she were asking whether I really wanted to make a scene over a little plastic rectangle. And I told her that there would be no scene because there would be no exception, that the policy was in place for everyone, and that if anyone preferred not to pre-authorize, they could absolutely bow out, and we would love to see them next time under the same fair rules, which drew a small nod from two cousins who had already completed the process and were clearly grateful someone else was carrying the awkward part. Evan tried the old fraternity move of mocking the manager about rules and hospitality, but the manager kept his eyes level and said the words that shifted the air around the table, explaining that without a pre-authorization from each adult, the reservation would be released back to the list within a few minutes because the restaurant had learned the hard way that groups who resist clear policies also resist paying on time, and I watched Linda absorb that sentence like it was a personal insult, when it was actually a neutral boundary a lot of places use now. Mom leaned in with a whisper I suspect she meant only for me, saying maybe I could just put my card down for the hold while everyone figured it out, and then we could settle later. And I told her quietly that later is the place where my resentment lives. That later is the word that keeps me up at night reconciling numbers nobody else wants to see, and that as hard as this moment is, it is easier than pretending I am fine while my stomach knots at the thought of another bill that disappears into the family fog. Jenna took out her card and completed the process without commentary, then looked at Linda with a simple question that landed heavier than any speech, asking why a grown woman who can plan a holiday cruise and a kitchen remodel cannot press a button on a payment app like the rest of us, and the silence that followed told me the performance had lost its audience, because even the cousins who love a good stir were not willing to lose a table they had waited for just to preserve a myth about my role. Linda reached slowly for her wallet, then stalled by asking whether the manager could make an exception just this once since it was the holidays, and we were family, and the manager, in that careful customer service tone that protects both the guest and the staff, repeated that the policy is the policy, that the wait list is long, and that he could hold the table for a few more minutes while we decided, which placed the choice exactly where it belonged, not with me, not with the manager, but with the person who had spent years treating my quiet funding as a birthright. I sat back, took a breath I let no one see, and said nothing else, because the moment did not need another argument, it needed reality to do its slow, honest work. And as Linda rifled through a purse that has always contained every card except the one she wants to use when it counts, the manager checked his watch and explained, in a voice free of malice or performance, that if a card was not provided in 5 minutes, the reservation would be released to the next party waiting by the door. After the phone plan was cut and the automatic payments began bouncing back, I thought maybe my parents would finally pause long enough to reflect on just how much I had carried for them over the years, but instead the backlash only intensified. And it became painfully clear that the only way forward was to formalize the distance I had begun to create. What I had done so far had rattled them, but it had not forced them to accept responsibility, because in their eyes it was still something temporary, a flare of temper, a phase they could outwait until I returned to being the steady provider I had always been. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that unless I made my boundaries not just emotional but also legal, they would continue to treat my money, my credit, and even my name as resources they could dip into whenever their own decisions left them short. I sat at my desk with the spreadsheet in front of me and began drafting a simple, clear letter, not out of anger but out of necessity. I laid out, in professional language, that I would not be responsible for any debts, services, or accounts in their names, effective immediately. I reminded them of the accounts I had already removed myself from, and I clarified that any attempt to use my information without my consent would be treated as fraud, not as family business. I included a repayment schedule for 2 large, temporary loans I had extended years earlier, loans they had promised repeatedly to settle when things got better, but had instead let drift into silence. I did not demand immediate lump sums or impossible terms. I set small monthly amounts, automatic transfers, easy enough for anyone to manage if they genuinely cared about paying me back. When I showed the draft to Evan, he raised an eyebrow and asked me if I really wanted to go that far. I told him that what I wanted and what I needed were no longer the same thing. What I wanted was parents who valued me for more than my bank account, who remembered my birthday with something more than excuses, who treated me as equal to my sister. What I needed was protection from being drained dry again. So I had the letter notarized and sent it by certified mail. That way there would be no claims of misunderstanding, no accusations that I had sprung it on them unfairly. The reaction was immediate. My mom called me, her voice sharp, accusing me of humiliating the family by making things official. She said lawyers were for enemies, not for blood. My dad's response was softer but equally evasive. He begged me to think about what this would do to the family dynamic, as though the dynamic had not already been poisoned for years. I told them both calmly that this was not about ending relationships, it was about clarity, because when people value appearances more than truth, sometimes paper is the only thing they respect. Grace called next, her tone dripping with indignation, saying I was ruining her celebration, that I had made everything about me when she should be basking in the joy of her new house. I listened without interrupting, and then I asked her one question. Do you know if your mortgage has an escrow account for taxes and insurance, or are you paying those separately? There was silence on the line, and then she muttered that she did not know. I told her she should probably start reading the documents she signed, because unlike me, no one else was going to clean up the mess when reality came knocking. She hung up on me. In the days that followed, I discovered that an old subscription account tied to my card had been used again. I knew immediately who it was, and without hesitation I froze the card and filed a fraud dispute with the bank. It was not a dramatic scene, no confrontation, just a quiet line in the sand. My finances were mine, and anyone trying to treat them as community property would face the same consequences as a stranger. For years I had avoided that step because I did not want to embarrass my parents or make Grace angry. But now I understood that avoiding embarrassment had been my downfall, because it had allowed them to keep pretending I did not mind. I also took another step that felt both liberating and strangely satisfying. I went back through the list of family possessions that had blurred over the years, items I had purchased with my money that had somehow been absorbed into my parents' or sisters' homes. Two of them stood out. The dining set I had bought when my parents' old one broke and they could not afford a new one, and the antique mirror I had gifted them years earlier but later discovered had been passed along to Grace as part of her housewarming decor. Both items had receipts with my name and my payment attached. So I arranged for a driver, showed up with paperwork, and reclaimed them without raising my voice. I simply explained, calmly and firmly, that these had been mine all along, and I was taking them back. The looks on their faces were priceless, not because of the objects themselves, but because it was the first time I had ever undone their silent assumption that everything of mine was automatically theirs. As I placed the mirror in my own hallway later that night, I caught my reflection and felt a strange surge of pride. It was not about furniture or money anymore. It was about reclaiming space in my own life, refusing to be erased or minimized. For the first time, I felt like I was teaching them not just with words, but with actions that could not be spun or ignored. Still, I knew the real confrontation was coming. Grace's housewarming was only days away, and my parents had already made it clear that they planned to use the event to showcase their generosity, to bask in the image of parents who provided for their children. I had no intention of letting that narrative stand unchallenged. I had been preparing quietly for weeks, pulling together documents, screenshots, and transcripts, all bound neatly in a folder labeled "It All Evens Out." Inside was one final page, a simple sheet with the word "choice" at the top, offering 2 paths forward: respect, equal treatment, and occasional help with boundaries in place, or no contact about money ever again. I knew whichever option they picked, I would win, because for once, I had written the rules. When the invitation reminder popped up on my phone, I smiled grimly. They thought it would be a celebration of Grace's new life, a show of their generosity. For me, it would be the stage for a truth they had spent years avoiding. And I was more than ready to step into that room with my binder in hand and let the facts speak louder than their curated image. The day of Grace's housewarming arrived, and from the moment I pulled into the neighborhood I could feel the careful image my parents had worked so hard to create, the polished version of reality they wanted everyone to believe in. But I reminded myself that appearances do not change facts, and today was not about keeping their story intact, but about finally telling mine in a way they could not twist or ignore. The driveway was already full of cars, and the lawn was decorated with balloons and banners that read, "Congratulations, Grace," as though she had achieved something extraordinary rather than simply been handed a house. My mom hovered at the front door greeting relatives like a hostess at a gala, while my dad busied himself with small talk and drinks, both of them glowing with pride, not for what they had actually earned, but for the narrative they had managed to build. I stepped inside with nothing but a small card for Grace, no flowers, no gift, no expensive gesture, just a plain envelope that held a list of upcoming realities: property tax due dates, the cost of homeowners insurance, and the penalties for ignoring HOA rules. I knew it would feel like a slap, but I also knew it was the first dose of reality she desperately needed. Grace tore it open in front of a few relatives, expecting a gift card or a sweet message, and when she saw the list her face dropped, followed by a forced laugh. "Wow, Megan, always so practical," she said, trying to make it sound like a joke, but the unease in her voice betrayed her. I simply smiled and replied, "Congratulations, you're a homeowner. These are your real gifts now." The living room was buzzing with relatives admiring the place, exclaiming about the open kitchen and the backyard, and my mom gathered everyone together for a little speech about family generosity and sacrifice, using words like "we" and "our support," as though the years I had spent covering bills, debts, and obligations had never existed. As she spoke, I felt the same familiar heat rise in me, the same anger that had simmered in silence at every Christmas dinner and every unpaid loan, but this time I did not swallow it. When she finished with a proud smile and the room broke into applause, I raised my hand and asked for a moment. The chatter quieted, and every eye turned to me. I thanked everyone sincerely who had ever offered me real kindness, and I made sure to single out Aunt Denise, who had been the only one to call me after my email and say she was proud of me. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the binder I had prepared, the one labeled "It All Evens Out." I walked over to my parents and handed it to them in front of the entire family. I did not raise my voice, and I did not make a scene. I simply said, "This is the record of everything I have contributed over the years." At the back is a page with two choices: respect and equal treatment going forward, or no more discussions about money between us. Today, you decide. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of pages turning as my dad opened the binder and began to scan the first section. I could see the shift in his face as he realized it was not vague accusations but receipts, transfers, and documentation, every line undeniable. He flipped to the back where the transcript of my mom's voice message sat, her own words calling me the family wallet. He froze and looked at her with an expression I had rarely seen in him, one of genuine shock and shame. "Did you really say this?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying through the room. My mom's face went pale, and she tried to wave it off as a joke, but the damage was done. The relatives stared at her, and for once the carefully built image cracked in front of everyone. Grace tried to deflect, making a sarcastic comment about me turning a party into an audit, but the tension was too thick for anyone to laugh. I leaned in just enough for her to hear and said, "Being a homeowner isn't just keys and decorations, Grace. It's bills, contracts, and responsibility. That's what adults deal with." She glared at me but had no comeback, because deep down she knew I was right, and worse, she knew everyone else had heard it too. I had come prepared for chaos, but instead of shouting or denial, what filled the room was silence and discomfort, which in many ways was more powerful. I did not need them to admit guilt. I needed them to face the truth without being able to run from it. I turned to the group and said clearly, "I am not your wallet. I am your daughter. That's the choice now." With that, I stepped back, leaving the binder on the table like a verdict no one could overturn. Before leaving, I took one final step to ensure the message would last longer than the embarrassment of that afternoon. I announced to the room that from this year forward I would be funding a scholarship in Aunt Denise's name, equal to what I used to spend covering my parents' yearly crises. I said it calmly, almost casually, but the meaning was sharp. My generosity was not gone. It had simply been redirected to people who valued it and used it for something meaningful. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, but genuine, and I saw tears in Aunt Denise's eyes as she hugged me. As I walked toward the door, I could feel the weight of the silence behind me, my dad staring at the binder, my mom struggling for words, and Grace fuming over the humiliation of her party being overshadowed. But I did not feel guilt, not even a shred. For the first time, I felt powerful in that house, not because I had shouted or threatened, but because I had calmly and methodically shifted the ground beneath their feet. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner, freer. I knew the fallout would come in calls, messages, and attempts to spin the story afterward, but none of that mattered. The binder was in their hands, the evidence was undeniable, and the scholarship announcement had already rewritten the family narrative in a way they could never undo. They had been exposed, not with cruelty, but with truth, and the image they had spent years protecting would never look the same again. As I drove away, I realized that whatever choice they made, whether they picked respect or silence, I had already won, because the power they had over me for so long was gone. They could not force me back into the role of provider, and they could not erase what everyone in that room had seen with their own eyes. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted, and it was not in their favor anymore. The week after the housewarming was quieter than I expected, not because the conflict had been resolved, but because everyone was still reeling from what had happened, trying to figure out how to spin it or recover from the humiliation of seeing their carefully constructed image collapse in front of the extended family. My phone stayed strangely silent for several days, and then at last a message came, not from my mother, who had been most exposed by the binder, and not from Grace, who was probably still sulking about her party being overshadowed, but from my dad. He wrote a message that was short but, for once, free of excuses. "I am sorry. You are right. We have not treated you fairly. I want to fix this." I read it twice, half expecting to find some hidden plea for money or some veiled attempt at manipulation, but there was none. It was not perfect, but it was more genuine than anything he had said in years, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that maybe the truth had actually broken through. Later that same day, Grace finally called, her voice shaky and more fragile than usual. She said she was overwhelmed because the first HOA fine had arrived in the mail, the insurance premium was higher than she had anticipated, and the county tax bill had already been posted online with a due date she did not know how to meet. For years she had dismissed every responsibility, knowing someone else would clean up the mess, but now she sounded genuinely afraid. I listened in silence as she vented, and when she finally asked what she was supposed to do, I told her calmly that she had two choices. She could either continue pretending reality was unfair, or she could start reading her own contracts, creating a budget, and living like the homeowner she claimed to be. She cried, called me heartless, and then hung up. For once, I did not chase after her or apologize. I had carried her burden long enough, and I knew this was the only way she would ever learn. The turning point came a few days later when my parents asked to meet with me in person. They suggested dinner at their house, and although I considered refusing, I decided to go, but this time not alone. Evan came with me, not to speak for me but to be a silent witness, a reminder that I was no longer walking into their house as a solitary figure they could guilt or manipulate, but as someone who had support and boundaries. We sat at the kitchen table where I had spent so many years listening to excuses and promises, and my dad opened the conversation with something I had never heard from him before. "We want to understand what it will take to move forward with you." That was the moment I knew they were finally ready to negotiate, not from a place of assumed power, but from the recognition that they had lost it. I laid out everything clearly, not with anger but with precision. I told them they would need to downsize one of their cars, cancel unnecessary subscriptions, and stop using me as their fallback solution. I explained that the repayment plan I had outlined in my notarized letter was not optional, but the bare minimum for us to continue having financial interactions. I told them that if they ever wanted my help in the future, it would only be under conditions of absolute transparency and equal treatment. And then, as the final step, I placed a simple boundary document on the table, already typed and printed, that required signatures from both of them and from Grace. The document stated in plain terms that I would not be treated as a financial provider, that any future assistance would be acknowledged as a gift or loan with clear terms, and that respect was not optional. At the bottom was one additional requirement that was not legal, but deeply personal. My mother would have to read out loud a short, two-sentence apology, acknowledging what she had called me in that voice message and retracting it in front of me. The room was tense as they absorbed what I was demanding, but I did not flinch or soften, because I had finally understood that being firm was not cruelty, it was survival. My dad picked up the pen first and signed without hesitation, saying simply, "This is fair." Grace rolled her eyes, muttered something about drama, but then added her signature when she realized I was not going to budge. My mom sat frozen for a long time, her pride wrestling with the truth she could no longer deny. Finally, with visible reluctance, she signed, then picked up the sheet of paper where I had written the apology. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. "I should never have called you the wallet of this family. You are my daughter, and I was wrong." The words were shaky and clipped, but they were real, and hearing them out loud, even in her resistant tone, gave me a sense of closure I had not known I needed. Once the signatures were done, I pulled out one final envelope and slid it across the table. They all stared at it, assuming it was another demand or condition, but when my dad opened it, he found a copy of a donation check I had written to the scholarship fund in Aunt Denise's name, equal to the amount I would once have spent bailing them out in a single year. I told them calmly, "This is where my money goes now. This is the last time money fixes anything between us. From now on, respect does." They had no response, only silence, but it was the kind of silence that comes when people realize the rules have permanently changed. That night, as Evan and I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because everything was perfect or because the wounds were healed, but because I had finally taken control of the story. My parents could no longer paint me as the selfish child, the dramatic one, or the endless provider. Grace could no longer lean on me without consequences. I had redrawn the lines of our relationship, and this time, they had signed their names under it. Later that evening, I received a short text from my mother. It read, "Thank you for the scholarship." I did not know. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether to reply, but in the end I put the phone down. I did not need to answer, because the silence itself was part of the new rules. They had finally learned that I was not the family wallet, and I had finally learned that peace comes not from giving endlessly, but from deciding where the giving ends. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had taught them a lesson they would never forget.